On a crisp, sunny afternoon in March of 1991, Michael Dunahee was a typical 4-year-old boy, full of energy and curiosity. He had a laugh that was infectious, a smile that lit up any room, and a spirit that made him loved by everyone who knew him. That day, like many others before it, Michael was outside playing with his sister, his mother standing by, watching over them as they played at the local park in Victoria, British Columbia. But that afternoon, something went terribly wrong. It started as a normal, everyday moment. Michael was running around with his sister, enjoying the freedom of the outdoors. His mother, a few feet away, was chatting with a neighbor, keeping a watchful eye on her children. But when she turned her attention back to the playground just moments later, Michael was gone. The search for Michael began immediately. His mother called out his name, frantic, scanning the playground for any sign of her son. When she didn't see him, panic set in. She rushed to a nearby park attendant, and within minutes, police were called. For the next few hours, the park was filled with sirens, officers, and volunteers combing through every inch of the area. Michael's mother stood in the center of it all, her heart pounding with every passing moment. The minutes turned to hours, and soon, the entire neighborhood was engulfed in the search. The local news stations arrived, capturing the desperate scene. The police were quick to assess the situation. "It's possible he wandered off," one officer said, his voice calm but filled with a hint of concern. "We'll search every corner of this park and beyond." But no one could have predicted how the case would unfold. As the hours turned to days and the days turned to weeks, the hope of finding Michael alive started to dwindle. Theories about his disappearance began to circulate. Perhaps he had been kidnapped, or maybe he had simply wandered too far and gotten lost. But despite their best efforts, the authorities couldn't find a trace of him. The search was expanded to neighboring areas, then the whole city, and eventually the surrounding counties. Yet, there was no sign of Michael. The case went from one of hope to one of desperation. Weeks turned into months, and the public began to grow weary. But for Michael's family, the agony of not knowing was unbearable. Every night they lay awake, haunted by the possibility that their son might never be found. The police worked tirelessly, trying to piece together what had happened to Michael. They spoke to anyone who might have seen something, reviewed hours of security footage from nearby stores, and scoured every inch of the park for clues. But nothing came up. There were no witnesses, no physical evidence, and no obvious suspects. Theories continued to circulate, but no leads were substantial enough to pursue. The investigation seemed to hit a wall. Michael's case became one of those unsolved mysteries, and as the years passed, the media coverage slowly faded. Michael's face no longer graced the front pages of newspapers. For many, his disappearance was a tragedy they had moved on from. But for Michael's family, the search was never over. As the years passed, the search for Michael became a cold case. The police, still committed to finding answers, struggled to keep the case alive in the public's mind. The family, too, found themselves caught between the hopelessness of the situation and the desire to continue looking for their son. Michael's mother and father, still holding out hope, often spoke of their son as if he was still out there, still alive. His mother, particularly, struggled with the idea that he could be gone. She'd spend hours looking at old photos of Michael, his playful smile frozen in time, the image of a boy who had been taken too soon. But for others, life moved on. The streets of Victoria, once filled with posters and appeals, began to forget Michael's face. The news stories grew less frequent. People couldn't hold on to the grief forever. But for the Dunahee family, the pain never stopped. There were moments of devastation. Michael's parents grew more distant from the world around them, withdrawing into themselves, especially on the anniversaries of his disappearance. They'd search the news, hoping for some miracle or a new lead, but year after year, there was nothing. The investigation stalled. There were still leads, but they were fleeting and vague. It was clear to the police that someone had taken Michael, but no one knew who, and the lack of evidence made it harder to narrow down the suspects. The trail had gone cold, and it was almost as if Michael had never existed in the first place. But Michael's disappearance never truly stopped haunting the city. The ghost of what happened to him lingered in the minds of those who still remembered the case, the fear, the unanswered questions. But as the years passed, fewer people remained invested in finding the truth. The search grew quieter, and the investigators moved on to other cases. Then, nearly 2 decades after Michael had disappeared, something unexpected happened. A new lead came to light. It was 2011 when the police decided to re-examine Michael's case. By this time, the memory of the little boy who had vanished in the blink of an eye had all but faded from the public's consciousness. But the investigators had not forgotten. Thanks to advances in forensic technology, a small team of detectives began to look at the case with fresh eyes. They reviewed old evidence, checked old witness statements, and looked into the places where Michael might have been taken. One breakthrough came when they discovered a missing link in the timeline, the possibility that Michael's abduction was not a random act, but part of something much darker. Then, in the summer of 2017, a tip came in. The tip was anonymous, but it was chillingly specific. The caller claimed to know the identity of the person responsible for Michael's disappearance. They mentioned a man named Thomas Jennings, a former resident of Victoria, who had been living near the park when Michael vanished. The caller didn't know all the details, but the information provided was enough to spark a renewed investigation. Jennings had no criminal record, but his life was far from ordinary. He was a loner, with little to no contact with others. His neighbors had always found him odd, reclusive, but nothing about his background suggested anything sinister. Still, the police decided to investigate. Over the next few months, they dug into Jennings' past. He had moved away from Victoria shortly after Michael's disappearance, and his whereabouts had been difficult to track. He had a history of mental health issues, an unstable individual by many accounts, and his reclusive behavior raised several red flags. The more the police learned about Thomas Jennings, the more unsettling the details became. He had no known family, no close friends, and his time in Victoria had been marked by strange behavior and disturbing patterns. A neighbor once described him as off, saying that he kept to himself and rarely spoke to anyone. His apartment was isolated, tucked away in a corner of the city, far from the eyes of others. But it was this very isolation that seemed to point to a darker reality. Investigators uncovered a few odd facts about Jennings's behavior. He had been in the park on the day Michael disappeared. He had been near the area but had never been questioned by police. He had simply blended into the crowd, just another face in the park. But the more they looked at him, the more they realized how his life seemed to fit the puzzle pieces of the case. The police focused their efforts on retracing Jennings's steps. They re-interviewed old neighbors, checked his old apartment, and looked for anything that could tie him to Michael. What they found would haunt them. Inside his old apartment, investigators discovered unsettling evidence. A series of photos of young children, some of which appeared to have been taken at local parks. And among these photos was an image of Michael himself, taken just months before his disappearance. Jennings had been watching Michael, possibly even planning the abduction for some time. This discovery sent shivers down the spines of the investigators. Jennings wasn't just a random person. He had been tracking Michael for months. The case had taken a terrifying turn. After following a trail of breadcrumbs, old receipts, unexplained travel records, and statements from people who had known him, police discovered that Jennings had owned a small cabin in a remote part of the countryside, far from the city. It was a place where he could easily have hidden Michael. With a team of officers, they set out to search the cabin. When they arrived, they found a disturbing sight. The cabin was isolated deep in the woods, far from prying eyes. The air was thick with the sense that something terrible had happened here. Inside, the police found evidence of a sickening crime. Michael's personal items, a journal with disturbing writings and photographs of the boy in various states of captivity. But the most chilling discovery came when they dug around the cabin's yard. Buried in a shallow grave, they found Michael's remains. He had been buried in the woods far from the park where he had last been seen. It was clear that Michael had been kept alive for months, held captive by Jennings before ultimately being killed. The police were horrified, but at least they now had the answers they had been searching for all these years. Michael's body was returned to his family, and they finally had closure. But it was not the kind of closure they had hoped for. It was a painful and heartbreaking truth. Thomas Jennings was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. He was tried in court, and the details of his crimes were revealed to the public. The trial was a grim affair, with the prosecution outlining the horrors that Michael had endured. Jennings' defense attempted to argue that his actions were a result of his mental illness, but the evidence was overwhelming. Jennings had planned and executed Michael's abduction with chilling precision. He had been watching the boy for months, waiting for the perfect moment to take him. The jury found Jennings guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Dunahee family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. They had never imagined that the person responsible for their son's disappearance could have been hiding in plain sight for so many years. The grief was unbearable, but they found some solace in knowing that Michael's case had been solved. In the years that followed, Michael's story became a symbol for the community. His case highlighted the importance of child safety and the dangers that lurk in the shadows. The Dunahee family worked with local organizations to raise awareness and help prevent similar crimes from happening. Michael's memory lived on in the hearts of those who had known him, and though the pain of his loss never fully went away, his family chose to honor him by advocating for change. They channeled their grief into something meaningful, using Michael's story to remind others of the importance of vigilance and care. As for Thomas Jennings, he spent the rest of his life behind bars. The world he once knew now nothing more than a distant memory. The boy he had taken, held captive, and ultimately murdered had left a hole in the world, one that would never be filled.